And if the judges would please introduce themselves.
Cool. Go ahead, Michael.
I am Michael DePira. I'm coming from Tallahassee, Florida. I work with the Florida Department of Education. And just a little inside baseball, I'm asking Tandy to take the lead because my 2-year-old took my questions. So I just didn't want any awkwardness when I was going to try to do it from memory. So thanks.
Okay. Well, I will be happy to do that. And I'll go ahead and introduce myself. And then when we come back, I'll ask the questions as well. My name is Tandy McConnell. I was a professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina for about 20 years. And then about 4 years ago, I decided I wanted to do something more interesting. So I became a high school history teacher in South Carolina. So this is what I'm doing right now. I'll ask Miriam if she'll introduce herself, and then we'll then you guys can introduce yourselves, and we'll come back and have the questions.
It's great to be with you all. My name is Miriam Mimar-Sadeghi. It's great to see your teacher again. I participated in We the People the first year it was offered, and the bicentennial of the Constitution long time ago. I serve on the board of the Center for Civic Education, and I've spent a large portion of my career providing civic education opportunities to people living in the Middle East region, in particular in Iran, where I'm originally from.
And would you gentlemen introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
Absolutely. We are the Unit 1 team from Maggie L. Walker Governor School in Richmond, Virginia. My name is Connor Diaz, and I would like to thank you all for taking the time out of your day.
My name is Varun Mundke.
My name is Nate Bampton, and this is our sponsor, Mr. Olmschneider.
It's great to be here with you guys. Let's get started then. We are your Unit 1 judges, and as you probably deduced, we're going to be asking question 2. Parliament passed the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, apparently in 1679. What is habeas corpus? And to what extent, if any, is it essential for the principle of limited government? How has the writ of habeas corpus evolved in the United States? Under what circumstances, if any, might the writ of habeas corpus place an unreasonable burden on the government? Please begin.
The writ of habeas corpus does not establish limited government, but rather responsible government. Habeas corpus ensures that even the most burdensome, strict, or even unfair laws follow a proper enforcement procedure. Habeas forces the government to recognize its own laws. And for limited government to work, a government has to recognize its own limits. Thus, through responsible governance, does a writ of habeas corpus become essential for limited government.
Habeas Corpus Act of 1679 did not create habeas corpus, but formalized it. Prior to its passing, jailers and other officials could use their discretion to hold people arbitrarily through an irregular and unregulated process, allowing for political suppression. In 1677, the House of Commons looked into a case where the king issued a verbal warrant to one of his ministers to imprison John Harrington, a political enemy. The monarch's use of an informal process and the shocked response of his minister, Sir William Coventry, showed the need for a formal habeas procedure. The act did this and provided for the immediate issuance of a writ and a return within 3 days for all imprisonments. Should a trial not occur within 2 court terms, bail should be immediately given. This formal process did not prevent abuse of law, but it did prevent arbitrary exercises of government power, thus presenting a shift in the nature of limited government.
Modern scholar Paul Halliday has further developed this argument, saying habeas was an executive prerogative and mechanism for the regularized exercise of power rather than a limit on it. The adoption of English common law in the colonies and the eventual codification of the writ in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution and many state constitutions cemented the procedures placed in the new nation.
According to the Judiciary Act of 1789, which first established a federal positive right to petition for habeas corpus, people detained by the federal government can petition for habeas corpus in federal courts. States had their own habeas process, but individuals had no recourse to the federal courts if the state process was exhausted. The Habeas Corpus Act of 1867 attempted to fix this, but was never successfully implemented. Later, the Warren Court's use of the 14th Amendment to incorporate protections like the right to a court-appointed attorney in Gideon v. Wainwright and protections from self-incrimination in Miranda v. Arizona at the state level made the writ an essential means of creating uniform due process across the nation. Now, imprisoned people have a dual habeas right, first to the state courts and then to the federal. Since the Warren Court, habeas corpus rights have been substantially eroded by both the Burger and Rehnquist courts and harsh legislation like the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. These limits on rights to petition for a writ of habeas corpus have disregarded the value of limited government in favor of marginal benefits for national security.
This exemplifies the ways that nations must grapple with the question of who is and is not deserving of certain constitutional protections, habeas corpus among them. The United States treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay is one such struggle. Prior to the 2008 Boumediene v. Bush decision, most opponents of extending habeas corpus to prisoners there, including President Bush's Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, argued that doing so would overburden the government and court system by taxing its resources. He warns that an increasing number of habeas writs being filed might necessitate an increasing number of public defenders that the state would need to provide. Further, Gonzales invoked the constitutional definition of treason, arguing that habeas for terrorism prisoners might delay the execution of justice in the courts by, quote, hampering the war effort and bringing aid and comfort to the enemy, end quote.
Justice Jackson also warned in Brown v. Allen against overexpansion of the right to habeas corpus. He says that it must prejudice the occasional meritorious application to be buried in a flood of worthless ones. He who must search a haystack for a needle is likely to end up with the attitude that the needle is not worth the search. In this, Jackson argues that overextended habeas rights make it harder for judges to identify meritorious habeas writs.
Judge Lee Sarakin quite effectively rejects the arguments of Jackson and Gonzales when he states plainly that judges at the district court level are, quote, not overburdened by habeas petitions. This, combined with the history of the habeas from 17th century onward, makes it evident that its ability to force the government to exercise the authority through regular, accountable channels is a benefit that far outweighs any potential minuscule burdens it might place on government. Thank you. We are ready for your questions.
And thank you very much. Let's just leap on into the questioning part of our the questioning phase of the day. If we were to suggest that habeas corpus is a procedural right, what is the natural right that is the basis of this procedural right? Is there a fundamental natural right that is the basis of habeas corpus?
I think several natural rights underpin habeas corpus, namely the ones that Locke lays out in the second treatise, Life, Liberty, and Property. People are unable to exercise or enjoy these rights if they are held arbitrarily or on suspicion alone and don't have access to the writ of habeas corpus.
I disagree with my colleague. The origins of habeas corpus, at least in the English tradition, is traced back to the Magna Carta, specifically chapter 39, where it states that no free man shall be punished, essentially, except by judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. This was the introduction of due process, and it is established well before natural rights, therefore establishing habeas corpus, or the basis for it, well before natural rights theory ever existed.
Thank you.
Let me ask you guys a question, putting Unit 1 and the writ of habeas corpus and due process protections sort of on the international stage. Do you think that these protections give America an advantage or a disadvantage? So take, for example, China, our chief adversary. These protections, these rights are entirely lacking. In fact, there's a genocide going on. Do you think that we're burdened by the need to provide all these freedoms and protections? Or do you think that actually in our competition with China, we have a lot of advantages because of those freedoms?
Those freedoms actually promote what we would call rule utility, which is an idea created by John Stuart Mill, because when we have those freedoms, we feel more secure and are able to live happier lives. And also when it comes to people's faith in government, that is severely linked to this understandings of liberties. If we look to Russia, a system where there is some protection for these liberties, they have a 48-hour window within which somebody must be tried or interrogated, otherwise they must be let go. In that system, they do have these protections, but they're not substantively followed, and the people feel less secure and they feel less happy as a result, showing why we must respect these natural rights.
I think to add on to what my colleague said, however, I don't think that the United States most effectively executes the writ of habeas corpus. I think we can definitely take some pointers from other international powers, namely the United Kingdom, which provides people who are being held during suspension of the habeas corpus right access to judicial review of their cases, which might lead to release, even in the absence of a formal suspension. So I think that we can definitely take this element to ensure that we don't have people arbitrarily imprisoned in the event of a formal suspension of the writ of habeas corpus.
An additional benefit we could see is also Canada's policy of abstract review, which enables the courts to more effectively view some of the concepts upon which a person might be detained in the abstract, therefore applying a principle that's been pre-established to cases instead of waiting for them to occur in concrete review.
All right. Considering how the courts ruled with the use of suspending habeas corpus for Guantanamo Bay detainees and Lincoln suspension, how might the courts view the suspension of habeas corpus in New York City due to Black Lives Matter protesting or rioting or whatever you want to call it at the time?
I don't think the courts would approve of the suspension of habeas corpus in that time. If we look to the suspension clause, which is in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, it specifically says when in cases of invasion and rebellion. However, Black Lives Matter movement, even when violent with the riots, is neither a rebellion nor an invasion. Therefore, it does not apply for the suspension of writ of habeas corpus.
I would disagree with my colleague only insofar as we must really realize how ambiguous the case of insurrection or rebellion as it's explicated in Article 1, Section 9 can be. In many cases, there were some of the people in these movements who did want to overthrow some government buildings, and this can be seen with the damage done to, for example, federal courts during these riots. So I think it's not out of the complete world for the federal judiciary to rule this, but I do think it would require a lot more consideration than was given.
Well, I would personally disagree with such a suspension. Because Article 1, Section 9 is so vague, often we have to turn to historical precedent to interpret it. And in this case, we'd have to turn to English common law precedent. The suspension clause was added to the English Habeas Corpus Act in 1689 to give King William the explicit authority to suspend the writ so as to preserve the peace within his realm. So I think that if they were acting in good faith with the tradition of the English common law history, the suspension in New York might be executed in a way that would preserve the peace there, and therefore not entirely at odds with history.
Though I would like to disagree with my colleague if we look back in US precedent. Back in the War of 1812, Madison specifically refuses to suspend the writ of habeas corpus because he believes that, in a case involving treason, because he believes that treason should be tried in the civil court. We can take away from this that the people should, when being punished, should be done by a civil court, and the means of habeas corpus, suspending it, should only therefore be a means of holding somebody, preventing them from doing that damaging action. Because these riots lasted for so short of a time, it can hardly justify the means of suspending the writ of habeas corpus for any valuable amount of time.
So let me add on real quick with that. Habeas corpus was not suspended with the January 6th riot or protest or whatever you want to call that. Would it have been justified to suspend habeas corpus then?
I think that yes, it would have been justified to suspend habeas corpus. This time we're going to turn to history, but instead of turning to English common law history, I think that Roman history is most relevant here. The founders definitely would have recognized the Roman tradition of electing a magistrate populi, which was a special dictator, special executive in times of fearful times, as Livy put it. This person had the prerogative of upholding coercitae, which is basically the idea that the executive should do anything within its power to preserve the peace in times of conflict. This includes the abrogation of civil liberties. So I think that if former President Trump were to have suspended the writ of habeas corpus, it would have been acting in accordance with Roman history.
However, I would disagree with my colleague for the same reasons I said above. It did not warrant enough time to suspend the writ of, it was lasted only one day, and it did not warrant enough time to suspend the writ of habeas corpus because they would have only been held for one day, and then they would have to be returned to a criminal trial in order to be punished.
Further, my colleague's understanding of Roman history, my colleague Connor's understanding of Roman history is also partially skewed in that he doesn't recognize that the Senate claimed full and total power to suspend the right to provocatia, which is an equivalent or analogous right, and they declared senatus consultum ultimum and did not give the power to dictators.
Given the ambiguities there, would we be better off simply getting rid of the suspension of habeas corpus so that habeas corpus simply will not be suspended in any circumstance?
That was certainly the reasoning adopted by 3 states during the Constitutional Convention. And while I think it may be useful in some cases, I think that over a broad generalization, we do need it in cases where there is a rebellion or invasion threatening the complete security of our country.
There are also definitely some benefits to a formal suspension of habeas corpus because it clearly defines which law governs the people being imprisoned. In cases like people under the enemy combatant distinction, they are not subject to a formal suspension of the writ of habeas corpus and are therefore not protected by either domestic law or international law. So it creates an even more vague state if we were to remove the suspension clause from the article from the Constitution.
Outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was an outstanding presentation. I think you have great reason to be proud of yourselves. You made a number of very broad thesis statements, supported those with very precise, very detailed data points. And then when we began asking you questions, you were I think the first time we've heard Roman history brought into this. It's always a great thing to hear. So I am at a loss for words other than saying I am very impressed and very much enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
Miriam, do you have a
I'm just impressed and thinking about the things you said and the flow, and there's just a rigor and a depth and a lot of knowledge and application, and you guys are a great force. I think sometimes slowing down just a little bit might be a good idea, just to emphasize maybe something that you really believe, or that you want to put a punctuation mark on something. But just terrific. You guys have so much to be proud of.
Thank you, Judge.
Yeah, I echo the other two judges and want to point out how when you do disagree with each other, it's very good in the sense that you're not knocking down each other's arguments. You're really building on it in a way that demonstrates the nuance and complexities in the responses. So your disagreements aren't necessarily disagreements. They're more of an added lens to look at the issue through, and it keeps the conversation moving forward. And I don't know if that's intentional or not, or coached, but that is such a positive way to bring multiple perspectives into the conversation. And then I don't know how to, like, you guys, if I were to need a legal defense team for myself, which God forbid, I hope I never do, I hope you guys have graduated by law school by then, because I would take you on as my defense. You just outstanding, impressive young men.
Thank you, judges.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Maggie Walker School. It's Maggie Walker School. So you guys have a lot to be proud of. What school are you guys going to? What schools are you going to?
I will be doing a dual BA program with Columbia and Sciences Po in France.
I am going to the University of Pittsburgh Honors College on a full ride.
I will be going to Schreier Honors College at Penn State on an ROTC full ride. Oh,
That's awesome. So cool. Yeah.
You guys are fantastic, and you just give me a lot of inspiration and hope, and congratulations to your parents and your teachers and your school.
Yeah. And Tandy, do it again. He missed it.
The hoo-ah.
Come on, Nate. You're gonna have to jump on that with your ROTC.
I gotta get inculcated first.
Hoo-ah is a way of saying just sort of it's just a all-purpose phrase in the Army. So just be ready for that one.
Thank you.
And it can be a question, hoo-ah. It can be a question, hoo-ah. It can be so yeah, you'll do fine there. That everything sounds really. You guys have a great future ahead of you. Best of luck in everything.
Thank you so much.
So
for taking
much.
the day, Judge.
Yes, congratulations. Good job.